Okay, today we're going to talk about factoring quadratics. When you have a quadratic, you're going to have something in this form, ax squared plus bx plus c. And typically, it's either going to say y equals, or if it doesn't say y equals, it's going to be equal to 0. Okay? And if it says y equals, you can just set it equal to 0 by saying y is 0. So it needs to look like this, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. If it's not in this form, the first thing you have to do is change your quadratic into this form. And I'll show you how to do that in a few minutes. But once you have that form, you're going to use what's called the quadratic formula. And that is x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Okay, so how this works is we're going to have a equation here. Let me write an equation. How about, let's go with 2x plus 3y. Oops, that's not what I wanted. How about 2x squared plus 3x plus 4 is equal to 0. And I just made these numbers up. You can pick any numbers you want to see how this works. But the first thing is you have to identify a, b, and c. A is the first number. As you can see, it's the one before the x squared term, so your very first number here is a. So in this case, a is 2. B is the number before the x, in this case the number 3. And c is the number at the end all by itself without an x by it. In this case is the number 4. Okay, so we got a, b, and c, and now we plug them in our quadratic formula over here. So we got negative, whatever b is, which in this case is 3. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, so 3 squared, minus 4a, which is 2, and c is 4, and all of that over 2 times a, which is 2. And now we start simplifying this. Okay, out here sometimes you have a double negative. In this case I just have negative 3. I'm going to write it over here for more space. Plus or minus and the square root symbol. On the bottom, you have 2 times 2, so you can easily do that and get a 4. And now we got to clean up underneath the square root. So 3 squared, which is the first thing you have to do, which is 9. And then let's take care of this. We got 4 times 2 is 8, and 8 times 4 is 32. And now I go back and look at the sign, and there's only one negative in all of this, so it's going to stay negative. And now we have to continue working. So now we're going to do 9 minus 32. And if you do 9 minus 32, you get 23. Okay, and it should be negative. So negative 23. 9 minus 32 is negative 23. And the next thing we got to do is learn what this negative is. So typically when you have a negative square root, you can't do anything. However, we have a new definition. The new definition says that when you have the square root of negative 1, we are going to find that to be I. So when we have the square root of negative 23, what we really are saying is we have the square root of negative 1 times the square root of positive 23, because negative 1 times 23 is negative 23. And this negative 1, we now know is simply I. So we're going to rewrite the equation we just have as negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 23 with the I outside the square root symbol. Okay, and this is actually the answer that we're going to stay with. If you want to be a level 4, we're going to separate the plus or minus out into 2 separate equations with a what's called a real part and an imaginary part. So it just means separate it out. And you can see right here you have negative 3/4. So again, I'm running out of space. I'm going to switch the colors on us. So we have negative 3/4, okay, plus or minus. And then whatever is left, we're going to divide that by 4. So we have the square root of 23 over 4, and that I stays there at the end. So this is our level 4 answer. Up here in red is our level 3 answer. And then by the time we get up here, you know, we're talking at very best maybe a level 1 answer. We really want to see this I out to be a level 1. So here's one example. This is the solutions for this equation. So I'm going to erase this, and we're going to try a different equation. At least parts of equations. Alright, so I want to show you a couple other things that may happen. So instead of just creating equations and doing A, B, and C, I'm going to show you what might happen. So let's say that we're taking our square root, and you end up with the square root of, say, 8. So when you have the square root of 8, because you did b squared minus 4ac, the answer happened to be 8, there's a couple neat trick that we were able to do back in Algebra 1 that you need to remember. And that's separate 8 into two factors that multiply back to 8, but one of those factors happens to be a perfect square. And the numbers in this case that multiply to 8 are 4 times 2. The nice thing about 4 is a perfect square because 2 squared is 4. So we know that the square root of 4 is simply the number 2. And we have another special rule that says that we can take a square root with multiply and separate them out. So this becomes the square root of 4 times the square root of 2. And as we just said, the square root of 4 is simply the number 2. So this is now becomes 2 times the square root of 2. Okay, so that's how you can simplify a square root that has something other than just any old number in there. So if you can find a perfect square, you need to take it out. The other thing that could end up happening is this. Let's say that I'm going to add a little bit more to this now. So let's say we had a 2 out here, and then we had a 2 in the bottom. Okay, so we're right here, and it happened to work out this way. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace the square root of 8, which is what we just found, which is 2 root 2. So let's go ahead and do that. So we got 2 plus or minus 2 times the square root of 2, and that's all over 2. So all I did is I rewrote this problem, but instead of the square root of 8, we wrote 2 times the square root of 2 because we just showed that the square root of 8 and 2 times the square root of 2 are the same thing. Now what happens here is we can separate this out just like we were just doing on the last one, and you get 2 over 2 plus or minus 2 square root 2 over 2. And now we have to reduce. 2 over 2 is simply the number 1 plus or minus. And over here, you can never cross out anything inside the square root, but you can cross out things outside the square root. So I have another 2 over here. So this is just a 1, and 1 times the square root of 2 is simply the square root of 2. So our best answer is 1 plus or minus the square root of 2. Alright, so the only other thing I want to show you is this. And you may end up having something like this. So let's say we start the problem, and you have ax squared. Let's put some numbers in here. Let's say we have 9x squared plus 6x minus 3 is equal to 12. Okay? Remember, in order to do anything right here, we need to have it equal to 0. So we're going to move what's over here by subtracting 12 from both sides. And over here, I have to do with its like term. So remember, x squareds match with x squareds, x's match with x's, and numbers match with numbers. So the negative 12 best matches with this negative 3, so we're going to put negative 12 right here. 12 minus 12 is 0. So now we have 9x squared plus 6x, and negative 3 minus 12 is negative 15. So from there, we can identify A, which is 9, B is 6, and C is negative 15. Make sure you keep any negative symbols with whatever follows it. So here's A, B, and C. And again, then we would just plug it all back in, and we're going to play that game again. Reduce square roots if you can. Cancel anything that's out. If it happens to be negative inside here, remember any negative square roots end up just being an I, and the numbers stay inside the square root symbol. Okay, so here's your review. If you have questions, please ask. But the best thing to do in order to get this stuff is to practice. So practice, practice, practice. And when you run into trouble, things you're not familiar with, ask questions. Because until you start practicing these and try some yourself, you're not going to know what questions you have. So you need to practice your own problems and ask questions when they arise, because that's the only way you're going to get better.